Ladies and gentlemen, in the absence of the Vice-Chancellor, who is in the Antipodes, as Pro-Vice-Chancellor Academic Strategy, I get the immense pleasure of welcoming you to St. Mary's on this very auspicious occasion. To introduce Anthony Towey would seem almost an impertinence. There are very few people of whom one could say he needs no introduction. I think I could say with supreme confidence, Anthony is that person. Nonetheless, he's not going to be spared just because of that. The first thing I'd like to do on behalf of all of us is to congratulate Anthony, as well as his family, and Karen is here this evening, on this well-deserved recognition of what you have done across a career. And it is, I think, it's become a cliche to say that careers are a journey. But in Anthony's case, it really has been a journey. From starting off doing work at the LSE in international trade and development. Yeah, we hadn't forgotten that. There is evidence. Moving on then, and we can see this in his splendid gown, to the Gregorian University, where he got his doctorate in theology. After that, he came back to this country. What happened there? There must be someone who can deal with that. And if not, you're buggered. So Anthony came back here and worked at Sheffield Hallam University and in a number of seminaries where he's very modest about his achievement, but his achievement was in the field in which he's become preeminent. It was in the field of theological literacy. And I'd go so far as to say that if you look at the way in which successive British governments have dealt with these things, almost the most urgent thing in our public life is to have more theological literacy. And it's to that Anthony has devoted his considerable intellect. He joined us here at St. Mary's first as a senior lecturer in theology. It's not fashionable to acknowledge these things, but Anthony has more than served his time at the mast. He has never disdained the hard work of being an academic leader. It ain't all glamour, and Anthony has done more than his fair share of the unglamorous stuff. But he's gone beyond that, and that's what the chair recognises with Anthony. He's played a leading part in reforms in religious education at GCSE and A-level. He has brought to the deliberations of the group working on this an experience of education that is second to no one's. He's also, of course, served as editor of the Pastoral Review, and he is most notably the director of the Aquinas Centre. All his work has centred upon that vitally important task of getting over to a society that has forgotten more than it ever knew about religious literacy. It's not a fashionable, it's not an easy cause, but Anthony has laboured in it long and hard. He has worked in the vineyard from the first hour, not the last hour. And if I may say so, although it is unfashionable, I gather, in some quarters to quote Kipling and if. Some of you know whereof I speak. But it still provides for me, as for many, a definition. If you can treat triumph and disaster, those impostors, both the same. And what Anthony has shown across his career is the nerve and the courage, and I will say the manliness, to treat both those impostors the same. And tonight, ladies and gentlemen, We are privileged to celebrate his triumph. And I'm afraid at that point there's a price to pay. And you're going to come up here, Anthony, and you're going to talk to us about the subject of Catholic religious education with the intriguing title, Lessons in Liberation. Anthony, to you.
Catholic religious education, lessons in liberation. Well, by way of introduction, I want to say that in some ways, at the moment, it's the best of times and the worst of times. Catholic RE enjoys robust health with new religious education curricula, new Section 48 measures on the horizon, and a new RE curriculum directory in view. It is a lively and creative space. Along with several people here, I've been involved with trying to interpret the government 2016 reforms in RE, which broadly speaking have demanded more rigour. It can be indicated by the first slide. This fell off the table, so it might not be working. Do you know?
Is there a health warning? This is triggering.
I don't want to worry anybody. You could be looking at your next Prime Minister, and it could be the one on the right. Jeremy Kyle, as opposed to Michael Gove. Michael Gove, some called him the Supreme Goviate when he was in the Department of Education. And he was looking for more rigour. In part, it was claimed to facilitate greater social mobility. And in the Catholic RE, well, in the RE context as a whole, but in the Catholic RE context, it has led to a certain amount of tension, it needs to be said. Since in our schools, well, we generally enter all students for the GCSE. And now, for perfectly understandable reasons, some of our pupils are genuinely struggling with key theological terms. That said, largely students and teachers are rising to the challenge, and exam boards themselves are reporting a profound change in standards and examples of theological literacy hitherto unseen at that age. So that's the good news. On the other hand, a series of public reports in 2018 implicitly critique and perhaps even pathologise Catholic RE by suggesting that the historic statutory right of the bishops to determine what is in the curriculum should be effectively abolished, and the standard supposedly neutral approach to RE be established. Here I'm referring to reports such as that by Charles Clark and Linda Woodhead, The New Settlement in RE, the impact pamphlet on how to regulate faith schools by academics from UCL and Warwick, and the final report of the Commission on Religious Education, which I was part of for 2 years. And as an aside, all of them suggest name changes. Charles and Linda propose RBV, Religion, Beliefs and Values. The Commission on RE, RW, Religion and Worldviews. And the impact team suggest civic, religious, ethical, and moral education with the acronym of CREAM. Perhaps for the first time in history, we have an occasion and a case of cream rising to the bottom. As Andy Lewis has pointed out, it is quite astonishing that what can be perceived as an attack on the 1944 settlement regarding faith schools has found its focus on an area of undisputed curriculum strength. And it is tempting to ask why otherwise intelligent people cannot understand the simple notion that theology rooted in a confessional standpoint can be properly critical and absolutely adhere to the academic standards of any subject discipline. Indeed, it is my view that religious conviction itself is increasingly being regarded with deep suspicion, despite respect for the same forming a key pillar of David Cameron's British values, which can be found displayed on the walls of every school in the land. We might have more on British values later. What might we do? There is always the temptation in such circumstances to add vexity to perplexity. But with the example of Brexit debates before us, perhaps in these more reflective circles, we might try and do a little better. I did sit on the aforementioned Commission on Religious Education for 2 years, and I had the privilege of engaging with over 1,000 RE professionals and sector stakeholders through detailed surveys and public meetings across the country. It can't be denied, however, that given the vast range and complexity of content possible in RE, a subject stuffed full of agendas, there may be mileage in the suggestion that commonality be sought via agreed approaches rather than agreed content. Examples would include Kate Christopher suggesting separating ethical questions from phenomenology of religion, and someone like Catherine Wright, the new head of Culham St Gabriel's and RE Trust, who is piloting RE curricula in an Anglican diocese, deliberately designed as a trifold path involving theology, philosophy and sociology. Now, Catholics shouldn't be too troubled by this, insofar as there's long been a layered tradition of training in pontifical institutions. Obtaining a license to teach demanded beginning with philosophy, continuing with theology, and then offering specialization program opportunities in a range of disciplines, which have long included, for example, sociology. I well remember, with Nicholas, Bishop Nicholas here, trying to fathom why on earth we were doing metaphysics before we'd even talked about Jesus. And now, at my grand old age, I can see why. I can see why. Since this idea of possibly using different approaches to RE as a way into the subject and looking at its morphology or its shape or how we should do it, since it's a complicated question, I will invite you, like a parliament, all to participate.
Indicative votes.
Yes. So I'm going to ask members of this august gathering, of whatever background of belief, to engage in a thought experiment. I will pitch to you what I think should be included in Catholic RE and invite you to do the same. After all, Cath Olon means according to all, or as James Joyce put it, here comes everybody. So, Peter? C is for an approach to RE. Peter? Here's a clue. Cosmology. We could have gone for critical thinking. Some might have started with contemplation, and maybe more obviously Christology. Yet while I do personally regard Jesus as the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, in a bid for initial, at least, maximum inclusivity and Catholic universality, let's start with cosmology for several reasons. As Maria von Trapp, or was it Julie Andrews, said, let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start, and that is exactly what Genesis does. It's an ancient meditation on creation, and it considers the wonder of the world, which in turn triggers fundamental lines of theological, philosophical, and scientific inquiry. Obviously, these include the questions, why is there something rather than nothing? And indeed, although Julie Andrews is not well known in philosophical circles, her famous line, "Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could," was quoted by Anthony Flew, the Richard Dawkins of his day, as key to his forsaking atheism for theism. It does point us to the fact that not only does engaging with cosmology nail a ridiculously false opposition between science and religion, where would we be without Copernicus, who was a priest. Newton, who regarded his religious writings more important than his science. I think he might have been wrong on that one. Faraday, electromagnetics guru, who was evangelical. Gregor Mendel, a monk, father of genetics. And indeed the author of the Big Bang Theory, to which we generally subscribe to today, and even has programs named after it, Father Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian Jesuit. These are all people who worked at the cutting edge of science and led us into new places, liberated our minds. So, consideration of our common home is a topic of importance to everyone, not just to Catholics. Whatever tribe we're from or stripe we wear, we are creatures in a relationship with the earth. Reality is relational. Atoms are relational. It is subatomic relationality that holds us together. The great excitement about the discovery of the Higgs boson particle is related to this, since, among other things, it proves God's a Catholic, because you can't have Mass without it. All joking apart, the theologically minded among you might ponder how this notion captures scriptural lines such as, "Through him all things were made." John 1. He is the icon of the invisible God. In him all things hold together. Colossians 1:15. That was John 1:3, by the way. And for a Catholic, at least, they advert to what is often called the sacramental nature of reality, that creation provides a context for encounter and the conditions of possibility for the supreme religious quest, which is, how do I love? Hence, care for our common home, which is another corollary of looking at cosmology as a common theme, becomes a concern for everyone, even if that is only dawning on some of us now. I'm delighted to see Father Rob Esdale here, who tried to tell me this 25 years ago, and I looked at him with the kind of unbelieving aspect of one who knew not what a man was talking about. Rob, you were right. And by the way, a chorus of voices, not just Rob's, from Pope Francis as loud out to sea, to Friends of the Earth, to children protesting ecological damage, should not be ignored by people of faith. I'd even give a name check to the vegans, because if you check Genesis 1:29, where it says, "I will give you fruit and the seed-bearing plants as food to eat," they may well be right. Lastly, just one more point on this cosmology thing. The first creation account also introduces to Sabbath, Shabbat. On the seventh and perfect day, we find liberation from doing, which is one of the addictions of our day. Let me enjoin on you as a Lenten penance or test. If you meet a stranger tonight, try not asking them what they do. We are addicted to function and create mental pecking orders in its 40-watt man-made light. Sabbath is a day of rest and liberation for everyone, when even the slave and the beast of burden rest. A day where C is perhaps for contemplation, or even just chilling. Peter? A is for... Got it in one. Oh. It's not a plant. So if we're not our function, what are we? This is why I think the A in Catholic religious education, to turn our minds as educators to what it is to be human, a study which traditionally comes under the umbrella of anthropology. If Genesis is correct, we foolishly define ourselves by our functions instead of our irreducible baseline dignity, understood as humans made in the image of God. Or, if you're not a person of faith, just humans. My first teaching here as a lecturer was on the MA in bioethics, and my most enduring contribution, I think, to the programme was to persuade the then course leader that it might be more logical to consider what we are before considering what we do. Too many of our GCSE and A-level specifications still present ethical theories independently from consideration of what human beings are. How can you decide what to do if you haven't thought about what you are? I have different expectations of my cat and myself. Not a great deal of difference, but there are some. And while I am a fan of Joni Mitchell's "We are stardust, we are golden," if we do go back to the garden, we find the basic picture painted by the gardener is that we are groundlings, breathing the breath of God. Groundlings at a confluence of infinity and mortality. Was it Pink Floyd or Gerard Manley Hopkins who described us as Jack, Joke, Potsherd, and Immortal Diamond? Now, much more could be said here. It is clear that Genesis brings up the whole issue of human freedom. But the Catholic contention, basically, is that this understanding confers an irreducible status to human dignity. Obviously, our tradition would acknowledge such concepts as the sanctity of life are not universally held. And our religious education lessons, and this needs to be heard, already present different views of what it is to be human, including materialistic views. But surely in this position, that humans have irreducible dignity, there is an implicit liberation at play, which is comprehensible to any fair-minded observer. Ab initio, it is a liberation from the mad metrics of significance framed by our society, which is dominated by a thought that you're only as welcome as your money, and the matrix of dubious sanity, where, as Oscar Wilde put it, we risk knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. Now, I'll move on to T. What is T for? Teleology. Any other offers? Teilhard de Chardin would fit well, actually. I've gone for not so much Teresa, but transcendence. I'll explain why Teresa comes into this in a minute. Wherever we have a moment of doubt, we're in a lovely English setting, T should be the order of the day. And one could argue that T should stand for theology, and that might be your bag, but I'd like to go, in this case, for transcendence, which may be defined as existence or experience beyond the normal or physical level. Now here, I'm not talking about transcendence in the Kantian sense as a condition for knowing, nor compulsory sessions of transcendental Thomism, worthy though they might be. I've often thought that transcendental Thomists sounded like a progressive rock group, but for those of you of a certain age, you won't know what I'm talking about. We didn't know what they were talking about, so it's a fair cop. I'm talking about much more basic experiences common to all of us, like this. Have you ever picked up the telephone and found the person you were ringing was on the end of the line already? Have you ever been in a place and known that you were being stared at? What is all that about? Without going all Prince Charles and talking to plants and things, which part of the mainstream curriculum in our schools even dares to deal with what might be called non-material reality? Eagle-eyed viewers, and there will be no test on this, conversant with the interim report of the Commission on Religious Education and the final report, might notice that Section F of the interim report has largely disappeared. As commissioners, we codenamed it Paragraph Spooky, and it would have entitled all students in English schools the right to consider, and I quote, the importance of experience, including extraordinary experiences in shaping worldviews, and how worldviews are used to interpret experience. The lamentable late edit, which has removed it, surely confines our young people to a restricted material view of reality, rather than liberates them to embrace the possibility of a spiritual realm, quantum entanglement, collective consciousness. Call it what you will, but essentially something we all see in every shoal of fish, every flock of birds, every football crowd. I know some of you will not approve of that. And many, many of us have experienced it at points in our religious journey. And I just want to say that it also opens up the mind of a young person or any person to the notion of the holy. I put Teresa up there, Mother Teresa, because I was once at a gathering and she was due to come, and everybody said, she'll be late, she's always late. And then the room felt different. Now you have to know this, she was about 4'2" or so. I mean, and maybe that's an exaggeration. Well, I exaggerate, but only a little. All right. She was tiny. You couldn't see her. And the room felt different. I don't know why, but we knew she was there. What's that about? And all I'm saying is, it's difficult for us not to have a subject, at least one subject, which starts talking about that area of our experience, which we find difficult to put into words. I'd also want to talk about transformative experiences and gatherings, such as, for example, World Youth Day, which broaden people's horizons and give them an experience of something that they don't get anywhere else. We had a teacher here, lecturer Lynn Schofield. I used to tease Lynn that she had more trips than a drug addict, but the fact she took students on trips broadened their horizons and changed their minds because of unseen realities. Having mentioned the holy, I can leave open what the next H might be for. Any offers? Holistic. Close, not bad. Anyone? Okay, Peter. And again. I can allow H to stand for hermeneutics, a word derived from the Greek messenger deity Hermes, and it means interpretation. I've long been fascinated by this branch of philosophy. For several years we ran an Aim Higher summer school for the local authority, helped by Valerie Naylor, on logic, critical thinking and hermeneutics. As I used to say to those students and to others, interpretation ineluctably comes into almost everything. But in the RE context, this rightly turns the mind to biblical interpretation, and in fairness to the national entitlement articulated by the Commission for Religious Education, hermeneutics is a central element. The way that authoritative texts are used and misused is vitally important, and much work is needed in this area at all levels of education and indeed society. Far too often, otherwise intelligent people employ fundamentalist or literal readings of particular texts, as if the library that is the Bible somehow fell out of the sky, instead of attending to its origin in oral tradition, unfathomable events, and contentious circumstances. In Catholic understanding, the Bible is the Word of God, and in the words of humanity, the Bible is the Word of God in the words of humanity. It is God-breathed, yes, 2 Timothy 3:16-17, but it also bears the smudges and thumbprints of generations of authors, scribes, editors, and copyists, never mind the travails of translators. Those of particular piety may object to the paradox, but it is commensurate with the central paradox of Christianity, which proposes a God-man, a Word made flesh, a virgin birth, a life-giving death, and ultimately a triune God. And why wouldn't it? Light itself seems to be both a particle wave, and if it can be both and, why can't the other elemental truths of reality be so too? Catholic interpretation of Scripture has always considered the sentence plania, the fuller meaning of the text, its symbolism, its moral importance, and eternal significance. And these play a full part in the discourse of academic, and it now plays a full part in the discourse of academic biblical scholarship. Yet for years, appreciation of subtlety in biblical interpretation has not necessarily been helped by examination boards who, in their bid to set questions for exams, set up binaries such as fundamentalists believe this and liberals believe that, which have given, in my opinion, my humble but correct opinion, unnecessary airtime to extreme views. It should not have taken till 2016 for examination boards to heed that Catholic hermeneutics are neither confined to literal readings nor their consequent fundamentalist beliefs when it comes to Scripture. Moreover, since one of the odder consequences of the 2016 reform is that the study of Scripture per se at GCSE and A-level is more likely in a Catholic school than a school of any other type, just take that on board. If you're from a sola scriptura tradition, it may be timely that the bishops have announced a year of the word, which I think importantly will redouble energies addressing the very important area of biblical literacy in schools. And I'm pleased to say that people like Bob Bowie and Farid Panjwani over at UCL, Bob's at Canterbury, are doing similar work across the Bible and the Quran. Looking at hermeneutics, very important. So Peter, we now move on to O. O is for orthodoxy. Ooh. I'm sorry I might disappoint you here. Ontology, a good one. I think I am orthodox, but yeah, I'll tell you what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to be a bit mischievous, but I want to use O as an example of what I consider to be good hermeneutics, because I want to consider... No. And again. Orientalism. Othering. This is associated with the work of Edward Said, although I first learnt it from a man from Nazareth. We had a professor here called Numa Sala, who was from Nazareth, and he used to talk to me and talk to others about the problem of othering. I think that if you look at the scriptures, and you look at the testimony of the life of Jesus, it's riddled with trying to challenge our inveterate propensity to others. Take, for example, the Good Samaritan. I've lived a long life now, and no student has ever asked me how old the Samaritan was, what day of the week he found the man attacked, nor even whether it happened or not. Some of the great questions that historico-critical scholars are addicted to sometimes are absolutely irrelevant. We know the story of the Good Samaritan. It's perennially true. It's true. It's got an enduring truth, a bit like The Simpsons, that shall not age. We tend to be like the lawyer, often tend to be like the lawyer, asking who our neighbour is in order to determine what the limits of our obligations are. In the gospel, he can't even respond to Jesus' question, who was a neighbour to the man, by saying he was a Samaritan. He says, the one who helped him. Now, whichever side of the divide you are, imagine a Remainer or a Brexiteer. It's tough. It's difficult. While we can coo from a distance about the story of the Good Samaritan and assure ourselves that we're not prejudiced, along come other stories. A sibling, the prodigal son, who wants his dad to hurry up and die, but ends up having a party thrown for him. Subconsciously, we other idiots like that, and as the elder brother in the story, we distance ourselves from them and say, we would never act like that. The challenge to othering is all over the gospel. Professor Chalmers has mentioned the late coming labourers in the vineyard, who get as much as the first. Step forward, Karl Marx, if not quite Jeremy Corbyn, because to our annoyance, one of the reasons I think we tend to get cross with that parable is, by and large, we're the people who've been picked first for the school team or the debating society. We have enjoyed physical strength or academic ability, so we don't know what it's like to be left behind at the 3rd, 6th, 9th hour. I don't want to worry anybody here, but others tend to come first in a kingdom where the last shall be first. Children are more important than adults. Am I discovering that now? Women proclaim the resurrection. The poor are blessed. The mournful weep. And this is before we think of folk from other races who will come from the east and the west if the privileged hearers don't have ears to hear. Now, fragmentation of society is obviously a concern for everyone, and without being dominated by it, I don't think religious education in any context, still less a Catholic one, should be indifferent to the government's agenda on inclusivity. From my own research, speaking to student focus groups, descriptions of RE as a safe place to discuss difference are, I think, still valid. One of the more moving moments of our work as commissioners was the vivid testimony of a 15-year-old lad in Manchester who said how RE enabled him to be a better friend to his Muslim friend, especially in the aftermath of the bombing at the Ariana Grande concert. Given that the Holy Family are presented as both asylum seekers and economic migrants, it is intellectually consonant with Catholic curricula that religious education should advert to the universalism inherent in its scripture and tradition, to develop habits that see in the blind, the lame, the criminal, the other, not the stranger, but the sister and the brother. Reference Matthew 25:40. So L. L is for? Oh, well done. Logos isn't bad. I would have gone for logos, but L is for love. I've often said that outside the context of faith, Catholicism may be broadly perceived as a 5-syllable way of saying no. Yet for all the troubles of the church, I don't think it is Catholicism, but rather no that needs a makeover. Let me explain. Back in the garden, we can recall that there was the desire for the fruit that proved irresistible. Genesis 3:6. We don't have to be religious in Lent or Ramadan to know that our appetites present us with a challenge either to our waistline or to our mental health. An addict, after all, is someone who can't say no to something and is therefore led by a particularly powerful appetite. No is a freedom word. And I think it's credible to understand the wisdom inherent in the covenants described in the Bible as that of a challenge to all humans who are gifted individuals to learn to choose the good. With my students, I've often drawn parallels with Frodo from Lord of the Rings, Luke Skywalker from Star Wars, and Harry Potter and Hermione from Hogwarts. In each case, the narratives turn on the drama of their choices. They could have acted in a self-serving manner, but didn't. In this reading, far from being a narrow confessional collection, the biblical books become an extended case study in character ethics, an area of development in RE currently associated, for example, with the research unit at the University of Birmingham. As Aristotle says, the aim of our studies, surely, is not just to know what virtue is, but to become good. Yet this liberation comes from the exercise of restraint, saying no. And everyone maybe especially the children in our classrooms, face this same existential drama. Love is essentially a decision, and yet its presentation in our context is ludicrously driven by eros and feelings, and rarely characterized by restraint in our somewhat unbuttoned culture. This despite the fact that the Me Too campaign is a global cry that there is more to intercourse than sex, if I may use those terms. When we've got a situation where even Russell Brand agrees with John Paul II, see the Theology of the Body section in textbooks written by myself and written by many people, including Kevin O'Donnell, who's here, and George Skelton and others, edited with Philip Robinson. It's interesting that far from presenting a restrictive view of human love, the Catholic tradition has an essential critique to offer this generation, which seems to have bought into a strange combination of Cartesian, hedonistic utilitarianism. Let me explain. Whereby my body is a pleasure machine that the little homunculus within me can use and do with what it wilt. Yes, I know there was mirth in the press when the headlines read, "Official, Pope says there's no sex in heaven," when preaching on the text of Matthew 22:30 about the man who died having had 7 wives or 6 wives. Someone could check that out for me. But it is a little disappointing that the pathway options, this is where it gets a bit serious, presented by the recent reforms on relationships and family by the DFE, almost entirely focus on partners, while hardly discussing the generally more enduring parent-child relationships that we see in our classrooms and experience in our lives, still less relationships between siblings and grandparents. Just one clip. I put before you Sophie and Hans Scholl, siblings who long before Dietrich Bonhoeffer became famous had given their lives standing up to Hitler. An example, surely, of love. I would also, on a personal basis, intellectual basis, lament the absence of any discussion of friendship. I'm not saying that love is overrated. My beloved is right here, right now. But as a matter of interest, Aquinas has amicitia at the center of his understanding of society and of piety. He defines caritas as a certain type of friendship with God, and he uses it to explain the purpose of real presence. And it should not be forgotten that his near contemporary, back in Yorkshire, I had to get that in, Aelred of Rievaulx, averred ultimately that God is friendship. A kingdom of life and love, a discussion of RE in a Catholic context, needs to acknowledge that life of love can be lived by those who are single. Another area where Jesus might be seen as a model and liberator. I. I is for?
Insight.
Insight. Ignatius, inferiority. Okay, take it away. We're not getting any closer here. Imagination. Yes, thank you. Now, despite the competing merits which are popular in RE circles looking at big ideas of identity, and I was tempted to look at the notion of institution, since most of us, our decision making is entangled with institutions in whose name we can do things we would never do as individuals. But that's another lecture. I'd want to be concerned to stress here, in terms of Catholic RE, imagination. The 2016 reform has allowed the possibility of this becoming a more formal part of the syllabus across the piece, and I, for one, am delighted. It has led to some interesting choices and examples from the GCSE RE textbooks. These include Adele on love, Fauré's Requiem and Mumford & Sons on eschatology, and dramas such as Les Miserables, The Art of Elizabeth Wang, The Architecture of Gaudi, all in place and taught in order to broaden the horizons of people studying religious education. It remains early days into this reform, but Catholic RE should be a place where the imagination is nourished and provoked. I'm indebted to Kevin, a doctoral student here, to a line from Julia Kristeva which might be worth pondering too. It's about the power of the aesthetic. She remarks that even in the most odious days of the Inquisition, art, almost because of its silence, provided sinners with the opportunity to live openly and inwardly apart, since they spread out the logic of speech to the most inaccessible folds of significance. Let me repeat that. Art provided sinners with the opportunity to live openly and inwardly apart, since they spread out the logic of speech to the most inaccessible folds of significance. Lastly, C is for okay, Christology. I had to get to Jesus in the end, like every decent RE lesson. I thought about contingency, I thought about conscience, I thought about character as such. But I hope no one will mind if I do focus on Christology, but maybe in a way that's inclusive of what has preceded, and in a way that, a bit like Eliot's famous quotation, we might arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. I'm not trying to undermine propositional understandings of revelation, but if we follow the logic of the gospel, we are looking for truth as a life lived, and that will involve thoughtful engagement rather than trite engagement with the person of Christ. In arche en hologos, the first words of John's Gospel deliberately connote Genesis, and the warning to the reader is that there's a new creation afoot. Folk familiar with the fourth Gospel, however, will know that for all the wooziness of the text, there is a contentious theme running throughout, which has led some scholars to characterize the Gospel fundamentally as an extended courtroom drama, a sort of cosmic trial of truth concerned with what it is to be human and what it is to be free. As such, I think it is of relevance, again, to any fair-minded observer and indeed to any watcher of TV, whether that be Perry Mason, for older viewers, The Good Wife, or indeed Suits, made famous by Meghan Markle, you may know her. Courtroom dramas are a tried and tested genre. And in this particular Game of Thrones, you are invited to be a witness. John the Baptist is the first, but then at Cana you have the 12 stone jars of water transformed into the wine of the new Israel, and the steward secretly knowing what had happened. A Samaritan woman with serial partners at a well. Many of you have heard this before. Isaac met Rebekah at a well. Moses met Zipporah at a well. Prior to Moses, Jacob met Rachel at a well. Hence the saying, where there's a well, there's a way. It was biblical speed dating. So when the apostles find Jesus talking to a woman who, after all, has had 6 partners, again, maybe it's 5, I exaggerate, but only a little, and she's not even married to the one she's with, they are concerned about the romantic connotations, not the fact that he's promising her living water, and she becomes a witness. The whole point is inviting the question, will you be a witness? Then a lame man. By the time a blind man is seeing the truth that Jesus is offering more clearly than his religious betters in John 9, you are meant to be figuratively murmuring at the TV. By the time Lazarus is raised and Pontius Pilate is asking Jesus, what is truth? You are meant to be shouting, you idiot, you're looking at it. The resurrection, which has John presenting Jesus as the new Adam, the gardener in the garden, with a woman, redoubles the sign that the 8th day has dawned. understood this gospel as just an example of Christology, is proposing that a transformation of the old world has come about, and humanity has been saved, nay, liberated from itself. We too often drift, as my friend George talks about, into vacuous vaporings when we speak of such things. And we need to root our Christology in accessible modalities that people can grasp. It's written as a drama. Why not teach it as a drama? Conclusion. Oh. Let's leave Jesus alone. The task of Catholic-Ari, and I would say in my view, the core task of St. Mary's, the task of Catholic-Ari, and I would say, humbly, the core task of St. Mary's in its foundation, is to keep this dangerous, liberating memory of Jesus alive. For someone like myself, that is because I believe that it is more than a memory, but a living power at work among us. But to those who disagree with that point of view, I would suggest that even as a teacher of wisdom or as an exemplar of sacrifice, the religious education proposed by Christ is sufficiently paradoxical, counterintuitive, morally demanding, and personally liberating to merit the deepest consideration by anyone interested in the nature and destiny of humanity. This same Christ challenges those of us in the Catholic sector, I think, to cross the barricades wherever possible and lend support to those who are in less propitious RE circumstances. It is, I think, a matter of great significance that the recent symposium on the new curriculum directory, chaired by Philip Robinson, who's at the back there, of the Catholic Education Service, had a number of observers and participants from outside the Catholic RE sector. I think he's to be applauded for doing that. It is also a matter of great delight that such work is being actively encouraged by, here at St. Mary's, by Annalise. I can't see Annalise, where's she gone? And colleagues such as Matthew Dell, that are endeavouring to engage with, across the piece, with Muslim schools, non-faith schools and Anglican schools. For the future, it may be time so that those who are suspicious of what's happening in Catholic schools and think it's just indoctrination, I kept saying to them, if that was working, why aren't the churches full? Close brackets. I also think they haven't met teenagers. Has anybody ever tried to indoctrinate a teenager? I've got a three-nager. I can't even do it at that age. It may be time for new inspection frameworks in RE to include observers from external bodies, to disavow them of their suspicions. And likewise, since we are a largely under-researched sector in terms of empirical studies, it might be timely to engage more deliberately with informative fieldwork, much of which has been pioneered by Professor Grace here at the Centre for Research and Development in Catholic Education. In reciprocal fashion, however, and I'm ending soon, don't worry, I would like to think that a curriculum exemplifying such dynamics would lead any fair-minded observer to acknowledge that Catholic RE offers a profound, ennobling picture of human life. In saying no to some of the suggestions being made by colleagues across the RE world that they should control Catholic RE, I think we are saying no to a modern form of cuius regio, eius religio, the slogan that bracketed the period between the end of the first phase of the Reformation and the end of the 30 Years' War. This is the idea that the state determines what the religion of its people should be. I think that's wrong. I think it's not liberal. I think it denies the richness of what it is to be human. And fundamentally, Catholic RE in that sense is, given that it's one of the few places where the dominant utilitarian narrative of our time is challenged, I think that our brothers and sisters across the piece in RE and the RE sector should see in the determination of Catholics to preserve their liberty to teach RE according to their own lights, but with clear eyes on what's going on in society and in life, I think they should see in that an essential defence of liberty, which is surely one of the values we all share, whether we call it British or not. Thank you.
Well, in a few moments after Anthony has had a chance to recover from that splendid oration, I'll ask Gerald Grace to give a formal vote of thanks. Anthony has very kindly agreed to answer some questions, and I'm sure there will be those. But I think we can say quite clearly, in what we have heard, Anthony has exemplified what Cardinal Nichols himself has said, that our Catholicism is our point of openness and engagement to the world, not our point of closeness. And if we ever wanted an example of that, I think we've just had it. And that gives you at least 3 minutes, Anthony. And Anthony's going to take some questions now, so I'll yield the floor again. Anthony, over to you. Do we have questions? I will. Okay. Right, we have one there, and then we'll go to the back. So, gentleman there.
Matthew Dell from St Mary's. My question, Anthony, you were a member of the RE Commission for 2 years, and the result was a report that wanted to initiate statutory change to the teaching of RE in Catholic schools, in fact all schools. And my question to you, the national entitlement, which was the heart of that statutory change, which a lot of Catholic RE covers already, why did the Commission want to influence what we teach? I think that's a big issue.
It is a good question, and on the one hand, the motive at one level was, unless proposed entitlement in RE is enforceable across all schools, then if there are sectors that are opting out of it, schools where RE is no longer not happening even at the moment will say, well, hang on, that's not even being taught. That entitlement is not being taught down at the local St Jude's down the road or St Francis Xavier. Now that is an obvious reason. I think there are other layers to the reasoning, though, which some protagonists in the RE world subscribe to. One is that they imagine that there is a theoretically neutral RE, which intriguingly they exemplify. I think it's an absence of doing philosophy. I mean, I think it's, they don't see themselves as reflective participants already in this. And they look at places like Sweden, where the RE curriculum is set nationally by a group which explicitly excludes people of faith, stakeholders of faith. Now, I'm indebted to Paul Barber here from the CES. This would be like, in languages, not consulting native speakers in your French curriculum. Why would you do that? Why would you exclude somebody who can speak Spanish, who knows Spanish, from your version of it? And weirdly, it sort of lends itself to, and as you can tell from my lecture, I'm a fan of John Paul II, but it turns into a kind of almost John Paul II approach to languages. I can say Happy Easter in 77 of them. There seems to be the ideal RE seems to be being proposed is almost, you'll know a bit about every possible worldview that there is out there. Whereas I would argue, and others in this room would argue, surely it's better to learn 1 or 2 languages well, and then developing a love for languages, explore the grammar of other religious systems. And I would have to say, and it's from the research which I've been doing with Peter McGrail, and Karen's been helping with crunching the max QDA and the qualitative results. In our schools, our students are enjoying doing a substantial portion of Judaism and Islam at Key Stage 4, which is 14 to 16, it's giving them time to engage with the other properly, in that sense. That's not a problem. But if you try to dilute that into, can you engage with 24 other religions, you can see that there's a problem here. So there's a good motive, and then there's a philosophically flawed motive, I think, for that. There's a phrase which I don't like, but I will air it, which is, RE needs to have the whiff of confessionalism removed from it, because that's the reason why in some places it's not being taught. I don't think that's the case. RE is not being taught in many places because head teachers are busy, they've got targets to meet, they haven't got teachers to teach it, and they know it's complicated. So it's maybe a case for addressing the supply side of talent in the country, rather than trying to control what's going on in Catholic RE.
Thank you. Now, we had another question over there.
You mentioned that the absence of young people from churches is evidence that the Catholic education system wasn't brainwashing them, but isn't it a fact actually that the Catholic education system is just totally failing and will not provide any faith to our young people? Speaking of parents.
I think that's part of the Catholic education system. I have sympathy with what you're saying. I've worked as a chaplain in schools and all those sort of things. And way back, I became quite early on that faith is caught, not taught. And in our church understanding, the primary teachers of the child are the parents. And that's the baptismal promise, and that is ever thus. Schools are founded and formed to assist parents in the rearing of their children, and hopefully giving them the wherewithal to understand the faith and the propositions of faith better. I still don't think we should despair, because I do think that we need to acknowledge that in God's good providence, certainly between the age, people tend to like primary schools. Lots of clergy like primary schools, and I understand that, and not like secondary schools. But I would put it to you that in God's good providence, as human beings get physically independent, they're able to live on their own, nature makes them that way, they have to re-examine everything that comes into their head to be psychologically independent. I think that's how God set it up. So I don't think we should particularly expect, particularly in adolescence, I think we should expect that to be a contentious time. And I'm told, I never ever looked it up, that there are parts of the world where, in the Orthodox community, or maybe the Coptic church, where they don't offer sacraments between the ages of 12 and 18 because people at that age are so mixed up, according to the bishops of that particular. And there's something in that. I think there's an age where you're looking for black and white, and the paradox that is our faith, I think, comes into view much better later in life.
Right, I think we've got time for one more, if there is one now. We have over there. Thank you.
I did toy, and Professor Grace is my witness, with the I being institution, or the H being hypocrisy. Let's have some lessons on hypocrisy. The first line, I suppose, is that any community that aspires to ideals and therefore fails, if you don't have ideals, you don't fail. So group belonging is not fashionable to the Labour Party, to the Tory Party, to any groups. Groups have problems at the moment because they're judged by the behaviour of their worst members. So I do think that there's a genuine truth in that. And I'd have to see to better experience teachers currently in RE of how they're treating, for example, in New GCSE, there are the four marks of the church: one, holy, Catholic and Apostolic, and my hat, so I'd actually give my hat to some of the teachers that have done great work on dealing with the holy in the context of great failure. So I don't, but I suppose the problem with any group, as Groucho Marx said, I wouldn't belong to a club that had me as a member. If there's a humility about our participation in institutions, starting there, I think that somehow there would be a maturity about how we approach and judge groups as a whole, and why we should not tar members of a group with the same brush. It's the first stage of othering. It's the first stage that makes somebody send to me a video of what happened in New Zealand within minutes of it happening. Why? Why would you do that? But the notion that people of a particular type or stripe can be defined by the behaviour of their worst associates, I think is something that every child will have to find a moment where they as an adult certainly, to come to terms with that. Because we might be happy to be British, but British values are very different sitting here than they are when a drone strike hits your village. You know, we can be immunised from the failings of the societies we belong to, depending on what comes down through the media and what we're allowed to know about. So, please don't get me wrong here. I think it's a massive issue. I think there's a lot needs to be done and changes to be made. But I do have the hope that keeping the conversation of religious education going will at least allow a chance for that to be discussed in a safe place.
Thank you very much. Now then, before we move on to the comestibles and the buffet, I would call on our own Professor Gerald Grace, who is head of our centre that concentrates on Catholic leadership, Catholic education, to deliver the vote of thanks to Professor Towey. Gerald.
How can I possibly follow that? Well, we have all received this evening a brilliant experience of impressive scholarship, perceptive analysis, provocative thinking, and wit, all focused on our subject, Catholic religious education, lessons in liberation. How many of us can say that liberation was our personal experience of Catholic religious education at school? Reflect on that. Now, given Professor Towey's provocative title, I was stimulated to take two actions. The first was to consult this book, the Cambridge Companion to Liberation Theology, edited by Christopher Rowland in 1999. I rather expected a lot of Gustavo Gutierrez, but he didn't emerge. But the ideas of liberation permeated everything Professor Towey said. And in this book it says, liberation theology has been one of the most significant movements in Christian theology in the last 30 years. Now, perhaps this evening, we are at the start of a movement initiated by Professor Towey to make the experience of religious education in our schools a liberating experience for our young people. The second action I took was to consult my grandson Matthew, an intelligent, thoughtful young Catholic of 20, now at the university, about his experience of religious education in a Catholic comprehensive school in Sussex. This is what he wrote. In my experience, the RE lessons had plenty of topics, unlike many other subjects, for discussion and interpretation by the students. This I thought was good and I enjoyed it. However, I knew there'd be a however. To become motivated to do well in this subject was a different matter. What mystified myself and others, we struggled with the idea, what is the damn point of all this? Now, I apologize immediately that a member of the Grace family should be using language such as that, when of course what he should have said is not what is the damn point of all this, but what is the divine point of all this? I have pointed this out to him. He goes on, however. It is incredibly hard to see how learning about the tabernacle will help me in the future in the culturally diverse, multi-faith world. Unless students already have a strong faith, there is no motive for others to learn only about, and this was a strong line. Remember, of course, he was at school quite a time ago, and things have changed a lot. But this is what he's saying of his, looking back at his experience. There is no motive for others to learn only about a single faith ideology. Well, of course, you could say that's a sample of one, and we can brush that aside as atypical. But what it does do is to suggest that we need to do much more research on hearing the views of young people speaking about the experience of Catholic RE lessons in our schools today. I am confident that Professor Towey will be giving academic leadership for such research. Inaugural lectures are expected to demonstrate that the newly appointed professor has an impressive command of the scholarship relevant to a particular field of study. This has been demonstrated.
So it's confirmed.
Second, that the professor can present this to a wider public in ways which are accessible, stimulating, and if necessary, provocative. This has been demonstrated. Third, that the professor is inaugurating a style of academic leadership and future scholarship and practice which will contribute to changing a particular field of study and practice in significant ways. This is confidently expected. And fourth, that members of this audience will say to their own grandchildren, you know, I was present on that evening when Professor Anthony Towey started the process of making Catholic religious education a liberating experience for young people. Now, this is what we have experienced this evening. I ask you then to join me in thanking Professor Towey for that experience. We look forward to seeing the fruits that will result from this inaugural lecture. Please show your appreciation.